I wanted to share with you a little story that I've found inspiring, and it's someone I was thinking about this last week because of the situation that we're in with the epidemic and pandemic and the virus, and that is Dr. Larry Brilliant. And he was a disciple, eventually, of Nimkarli Baba Maharaji in India at the same time that Ram Dass was there as well, the American Ram Dass. And Larry Brilliant was a very active hippie. He was part of the civil rights movement. He was political left-wing, demonstrating. He was part of a medical thing that was also left-wing. He was just very active, and then ended up in India. He and his little group, which included his wife and Wavy Gravy, went to India with the purpose, I believe I remember, of going to Bangladesh and helping to feed people there. Well, once they got to India, they realized that the Indian government was not going to let them get anywhere near Bangladesh. I mean, it was a big political problem and everything that was happening there. So by and by, they ended up at Maharaji's ashram, Nimkarli Baba, which is on the way to Baba Eradicate and Babaji's cave. It's up in that area northeast of Delhi. And so they were there, and then he went off, but his wife really loved Maharaji and stayed at the ashram and was really getting into the whole scene there and understood who Maharaji was, a very great soul. But Larry Brilliant couldn't relate to it all. I think he was probably pretty Rajasic at that point, and yet he wanted something more. And so she kept saying, come, just spend some time here. And so he came, and this was probably around 1972 or so. And so he ended up at the ashram at Kainchi, and he stayed there for 8 days. And the whole time that he was there, everybody was dressed in white and bowing at Maharaji's feet, and Maharaji was entertaining everybody and relating to them and completely ignoring Larry Brilliant. And so day by day, he spent 8 days like this. Each day he thought, what am I doing here? I really don't relate to all these Westerners, and it just feels creepy, and they're bowing down at this man's feet. He's big, fat, and I don't understand any of this, you know. So he, by the eighth day, was pretty fed up and going to leave. He felt bad. His wife felt bad. They would be splitting up, but he just couldn't get into it. And so the day before he was going to leave, he didn't go to the satsang that day. And he ended up going to a nearby lake and just really was miserable. He was just saying, what on earth is my life about? I just can't relate to this, and yet all these people that I respect are there. And so I just don't know what to do. And he was so desperate that he said himself, I actually prayed. He never had done anything like that before, and nothing came. And so the next day in the morning, he and his wife went early to the satsang, and in his mind he was just going to say all this to Maharaji and then leave. And, in other words, I don't understand this, who you are and why all these people are doing all of this, and then leave. And so they were sitting there. They went early, and the little tucket where Maharaji would sit was empty. He wasn't there, and nobody else was there, just he and his wife. And so he was sitting there right in front. And he noticed that someone had left a piece of fruit on the tucket, and it had rolled off onto the ground. And so he just casually leaned over to pick up the piece of fruit, and instantly Maharaji was there. And he stepped on his hand. and Larry Brilliant said, there I was. And he pinned him there. He didn't let up. And Larry Brilliant said, there I was in the very position I thought was disgusting, bowing at this man's feet. And then Maharaji, and all of this is through an interpreter. He didn't speak English. Maharaji got really close to him and he said, "So, you went to the lake yesterday. Did you go swimming? No. Did you go boating? No. Did you talk to God? Did you," and Larry Brilliant in his own autobiography is saying, "My mind was just reeling." He knew all of this. Nobody knew any of this, even his wife. And then he said, "Did you ask God for something?" And he said at that point, he just opened up. Somehow that conversation, even though it wasn't very long, just went into his heart and opened him. And he just started weeping. And then by the time that happened, all the other people were coming who he had looked at as just, weird people, Westerners in white, and that was so ridiculous. And he realized that all of them had been through the same thing that he just went through in their own unique way. But they all had to have their hearts open, basically. And so from that point on, he was with Maharaji. He and his wife stayed together, and he was there. And so they would go to the satsangs. I don't know exactly how the format was, but anyway, Maharaji started really noticing him. And he said, Dr. America. That's what he started calling him, Dr. America. And he said, "So how much money do you have?" And he thought, and so he said, "I've got $500. And he said, "Oh, you're no doctor." "You're no doctor." And then he said, "How much money do you have in America?" He said, "Well, I have another 500, but Maharaji, I have a lot of debt from medical school." And Maharaji just kept right on moving. He said, "You know doctor, U-N-O doctor." And what he was really, it got mixed up in the translation. What he was really saying to him is, United Nations Organization doctor. That's what I want you to do. And so finally, when that got a little more clear, then he said, you need to go and work for the United Nations, and you're going to give vaccinations, and you're going to help eradicate. He didn't use the word eradicate at that point, but you're going to help with smallpox, the smallpox program. And so Larry Brilliant just, was like, okay, and he was into it, but it wasn't an easy thing. And so he had already gone to the United Nations WHO office and casually inquired about being hired by them. And they said, "No, we don't hire American doctors, and you're not qualified." And, they only hired experts. And so he just let that go. But then Maharaji brought it up. And so, and after he asked him, "Have you got your job yet?" Every time he'd see him, he'd ask, "Dr. America, have you got your job yet?" And he'd say, "No, Maharaji, I haven't." He'd try to drop the subject. And then finally Maharaji said, "You need to go to Delhi and apply for a job there." And so he did. He was trying to really be a good disciple at this point. And so he and his wife made the journey. Now, this is the early 70s. Anybody who's traveled in India knows travel is not easy, period. So you get on the rickshaw, you go to the bus, you go to the train, you end up in Delhi, and then you come back the same way. It took all day, And so he went, and I believe maybe they stayed overnight. But he said they went to the Barmans, which were a couple that were devotees of Maharaji. And he borrowed Barman's suit. He didn't have clothes to wear to apply for a job. So he borrowed his suit, he pulled his hair back in a ponytail, tucked it under the collar of his white shirt, bought a terrible-looking tie, and he said, "I looked ridiculous, but I was trying to look normal, So anyway, he went to the office, and they said, "No, you can try to apply, but you're not qualified. You're not an epidemiologist. You don't have any credentials, and we're not hiring Americans." he said this same process. And then they went back and he told Maharaj, did you get the job? No, Maharaji. And so that went on for months. And he said, my wife and I made probably 10 trips to Delhi and back in that way. Same scene every time. And then finally, the woman, and he was also very, Larry Brilliant, very upfront about, why are you applying for this job? And he said, my guru told me to. He said I would give vaccinations and help with smallpox program. And they just looked at him like, really, you know. Anyway, but so finally the woman who really liked him, he was very upfront about who he was and all of that. And she said, you know, there is a position that you may be able to get. She said, can you write? And he said, yeah, I can write, sure, why not? And so she ended up hiring him as administrative assistant. And so that worked. He could be hired as that. He wasn't a doctor. He was just working in the office. And as that progressed, so he got hired. And so he said that period of time was very interesting because during the week, he would work at WHO in Delhi. On the weekends, they would go back to the ashram and spend time with Maharaji, which is where they really wanted to be. And so Maharaji was very aware of what was happening with that smallpox program and what wasn't happening. And so at one point he said, after I had been there, and just to say, nobody in the UN, nobody in India was interested in activating this smallpox program because they didn't think it was possible to eradicate smallpox in India, which was the goal of the UN at that time. They had done that in every other country of the world except 4, and one of them was India. And India in particular, probably because of the caste system, of the villages, of the amount of people, they just said, no way, it will never happen. But 3 months into his job, he said, I had a 3-hour-long conversation with Maharaji about smallpox. And he said he knew everything about that disease. He said he knew where it was located, where the bad epidemics were, where the seasons were, what the transmission cycle was, what places we would have trouble with. He said he knew everything epidemiologically about smallpox. And so Larry Brilliant said, okay, you know all of that. Will smallpox be eradicated? And this was his answer, Maharaji's. He said, smallpox will be eradicated. This is God's gift to mankind because of the hard work of dedicated medical scientists. And that was how they got eventually into all the villages. Maharaji, you see, was well known, and his word, when he said something like that, it came true. And so he said what happened is that people were starting to be sent out, the vaccinations were starting to happen, but still people didn't have a lot of hope. But finally, at the very end, because they couldn't send him out as a doctor, he wasn't hired as a doctor, that the Russian doctors that were supposed to come were delayed. And so they sent him and his wife out to this very remote area where they wanted them to start the program there. And he said this was how it worked, that we would go, we would drive up in our Jeep. We had a big picture of Maharaji on the dashboard. And we would go and talk to the civil surgeon for that region. Now, this is somebody responsible for a whole area of what's going on medically. And they would lay out the program, smallpox, vaccinations, what they wanted to do. And the man would say, I'm very busy. I really don't have time for this. We have other issues we're dealing with, and I can't take this on. And then because Indians are polite, he would walk them back to their jeep. And then he would see the big photo of Maharaji. And because these are two Westerners, remember? And he'd say, "Who's that? And why is that picture there?" And Larry Brilliant would say, "Oh, that's my guru. And he told me that smallpox will be that's Nimkarli Baba. And he told me that smallpox will be eradicated in India because of the good, hard work of dedicated medical scientists." And then there would be a pause. And then the man would say, "Why don't you come back to my office and let's have tea and talk about this program?" And he said that, and the reason I'm telling this story is that it's about the vine, it's about the branches, and it's about Larry Brilliant was very upfront about where his energy and knowledge and all of that was coming from. And so Maharaji was able to work through him and move out into India in all these areas. He said that started an ongoing thing that I just described about the surgeon. That happened, he said, repeatedly, that people came, they went places, no, oh, Maharaji said that. Oh, okay, well, let's, and that he then would take the program, the plan, back to Maharaji at the ashram, and Maharaji would outline what the plan should be, how to do it. And then he would take it back to the UN and they would implement. And he knew how to deal with people. He knew how to make it work in India. So anyway, it just was fascinating to me because all the steps along the way, once Larry Brilliant got who Maharaji was and the power that was there, he used that as a disciple because he didn't have any standing. He wasn't an epidemiologist. He was barely a doctor. And yet that energy was able to move through and go out into India. By the time they started really the big program, a big push, it was after Maharaji had passed, but it was in the beginning of 1974, and he said 2 years later, smallpox, with a tremendous effort. I think he said there were 400 medical people out in the field and thousands of others helping. But 2 years later, smallpox was eradicated in India. Yeah, it was just mind-boggling. Nobody thought it could ever happen. And then that it happened so quickly. But it gained momentum because people started believing in it. They knew if Maharaji had said that, it could happen. And he said the spirit among the people that were in the smallpox program was totally different from the other programs that they were doing medically. And so the people were inspired. They knew it could work, and therefore it did work. So I just found that very inspiring that he was able to turn that way and to really move energy so dynamically with Maharaji right there behind him, just telling him how to make it work, how to deal with it all.